Les gens, les boxeurs qui sont style, moi c'est très agressif. Ils ont toujours ces t-shirts un peu à la Tyson, là, les shorts de fou, un petit
And when I say you must obey, just like the bulldog in Sakurai.
Et là, Maïva, c'est son milieu.
Ouais, mais le crochet. Magnifique shot.
Ah, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Eh ouais, le crochet au foie, il a touché.
Là, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Pendant Bigbois,
Maïva
encore un
va
rouge.
au corps.
Allez, ça va être dur là. Qui a arrêté.
Oui, forcément, elle remet un genou au sol.
Et elle regarde son point. Ça va dans tous les sens, là, par les deux boxeuses. Et tout ça par les gros points. Elle a touché encore un nouveau point. Elle a du mal, Viviane. Elle a du mal à récupérer.
Welcome to the motherfucking replay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, per tweet from Carlos Toro, Michael Coffie will face Jonathan Rice in the main event of this Saturday's PBC on Fox card. Coffie was originally scheduled to face former title challenger Gerald Washington, but was forced to withdraw due to a positive COVID test. And this is the headline fight, folks, if you can believe that. Coffie versus Washington, what would otherwise be an undercard fight on any other platform you name. ESPN, DAZN, BT Sports, Sky. This ain't the kind of fight.
You guys ever heard of quality control?
I mean, seriously, it's nothing against Michael Coffie, but he's not at a stage in his career to where he needs to be headlining cards, because if he does, he's not going to bring you but so many ratings, so many views, so many viewers. Where is Keith Thurman? What's he so fucking busy with? Where's Gary Russell Jr.?
Why's Charles Martin chasing a Dillian Vite fight?
Why was the original scheduled match a fight between Michael Coffie and Gerald Washington when it could have been Michael Coffie versus Charles Martin? What's happening here?
The original fight wasn't much to write home about.
Did you guys notice that when Stefan Espinoza and the people over there at Showtime rolled out their schedule of PBC on Showtime matches, Fox did not do the same?
They didn't have a whole bunch of fights scheduled on Fox, did they?
Big ones or small ones. I mean, Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence Jr., if you know what the particulars are, you'll know that that was purely happenstance. That wasn't what was originally set to go down, because Manny Pacquiao was supposed to do something with Mikey Garcia and Conor McGregor. That was Manny's plan. That changed when Conor lost in the octagon to Dustin Poirier the second time in their second fight.
And he was supposed to fight Mikey on DAZN.
All of that falls through, and suddenly his name gets tacked onto the name of Ryan Garcia. It gets tacked onto the name of Terrence Crawford, very briefly, but these were potential matchups that were being talked about for Manny. All of that stuff falls through. Then he lands on Errol Spence Jr. It was purely happenstance, because Manny's original plan seems to have consisted of a lot of other things.
Doesn't look like the original plan was to fight Spence.
Alterations were made, and that's what he's doing now. And I think that was a big save for the PBC on Fox, because they needed to deliver them something big, especially with Tyson Fury and the fiasco that he was all entangled in. And they can't even take all the credit for that situation, the Wilder versus Fury trilogy, because that's a joint pay-per-view between Fox and ESPN. You know, when the PBC first climbed into bed with Fox, the initial plan was to stage about 5 pay-per-views annually. 5 pay-per-view events. A lot has happened since then. A lot has happened since
They made that deal.
people over there at the PBC climbed into bed with Fox. Obviously, the pandemic, that definitely affected things. And I think it has left the PBC's programming on Fox a little worse for wear. You can see signs that the budget was cut when the shoulder programming for PBC on Fox was given the axe last year.
They started trimming the fat.
I don't know if it's my imagination, but what that heralds are budget cuts. Budget cuts to how much money Fox is willing to spend on PBC's programming. You look at the year of 2021, and there's not much to talk about as far as what's been on Fox PBC, aside from the Spence versus Pacquiao happenstance.
Yeah.
What is to be the joint venture with ESPN for the Wilder versus Fury trilogy, and what could be the Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant pay-per-view. And when it comes to that, I think that Fox's future with the PBC is contingent upon that and several other things.
How Spence versus Pacquiao does.
How many buys that brings in, how much revenue that generates. I think that Fox's future with the PBC is also contingent upon whether or not they'll actually make some money this time from Wilder versus Fury, because they didn't the last time, and whether or not they can get Canelo Alvarez to do more business with them beyond that Caleb Plant fight, because what Fox wants to do is stage 5 pay-per-views annually, and
There's no quality control over there.
I mean, they had the audacity to put Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Chris Arreola on pay-per-view, and we all know as boxing fans, that is not the kind of fight that belongs behind a paywall.
Coffie versus Rice is a headline fight.
The unbeaten up-and-comer Michael Coffie, unbeaten, albeit very much unknown Michael Coffie, versus Jonathan Rice, who's standing in for Gerald Washington. Jonathan Rice, who's coming off of 2 consecutive losses to Dempsey McKean and F.A. Ajagba.
Oh, you'll let any 2 guys headline a fight on PBC Island, huh?
Listen, I can only tell you what I think. And if you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do. I don't think that Fox has it in the budget anymore to put on a full-on schedule, at least not right now, the way that Showtime did earlier this year. I think that whatever finances they have been allocated to trying to get Canelo Alvarez on board, because they know that he's guaranteed cash, whereas their stable of fighters aren't.
No.
You know, you're going to have guys like Keith Thurman that have big financial demands. You're going to have guys like Gary Russell Jr. He wants to get paid a certain way too, but you ain't gonna fritter money away on those guys because they ain't gonna bring you nothing back. Keith Thurman versus who on pay-per-view? Millions of dollars on a Gary Russell Jr. fight to fight who?
Gary ain't got no buzz.
I mean, look, I could be wrong about this, but I'm kind of getting the sense that if you haven't seen Keith, it's because Keith wants to get paid a certain way every time he goes out there. And they can't pay him that way right now to fight in a tune-up fight.
Which is what he would need. He hasn't fought in 2 years.
If you want a multi-million-dollar payday, you're gonna have to get out there against somebody that's interesting and the kind of fight that would actually yield some kind of a return. And Keith's not going to do that because Keith's been out for 2 years. He needs a tune-up fight, but they ain't got it in the budget to overpay him. Gary Russell Jr., similar situation for a fighter that has no buzz, no momentum whatsoever, in spite of being the longest reigning champion right now.
They're reallocating all their resources.
They didn't roll out a big schedule the same way that Showtime did. They've reallocated their resources to fights that they feel might be commercially successful, like Pacquiao versus Spence, hopefully Wilder versus Fury, even though it lost the money the last time, and Canelo Alvarez, Canelo versus Plant.
They can't waste money on foregone conclusion fights anymore.
For fat and happy fighters, prima donnas, peacocks really that expect to make $1 million or in excess of $1 million, kicking a can down the road. I get the sense that the reason certain fighters are sitting out, I get the sense that the reason Fox didn't roll out a big schedule the same way that Showtime did, I get the sense that so much focus, so much attention, effort, and resources are going into bringing Canelo over to their side of things. I get the sense they're doing this because what they've been doing so far hasn't been delivering, and they've burned through a lot of cash.
That and the pandemic hit him hard.
Not necessarily Fox, not Fox as a whole, Fox the network, but PBC's engagement with Fox, because Fox is going to be okay, but PBC, I don't know. I get the sense they've got a lot riding on Pacquiao and Spence. I get the sense they've got a lot riding on Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant and potentially getting Canelo to do more business with them, because what they do have, it's not enough to put on successful pay-per-views, not 5 times a year.
Not commercially.
If Errol Spence Jr. beats Manny Pacquiao this summer, that doesn't guarantee that Errol will be able to bring you big numbers with every fight thereafter. It doesn't. He doesn't miraculously absorb all of Manny Pacquiao's paying customers, his paying fans, for beating him. I mean, you do understand that. You know, Antonio Tarver beat Roy Jones Jr., who was the most electrifying fighter at the time. But Antonio Tarver's career didn't exactly have all the excitement that Roy's did, even after Antonio beat him. And it's a similar situation here. If Wilder loses again to Tyson Fury, if he loses again in October, what are they going to have? They needed Canelo Alvarez to help them sell pay-per-views, and if they can't get him to do more business with them, if they can't get him on board for a multi-fight deal, then what have you really got? An active Keith and an active Gary.
And more cards like Coffie versus Rice.
More cards like Plant versus Truax and Jamal James versus Thomas Delorme.
And pay-per-views like Ruiz versus Areola.
I just get the sense that the PBC's relationship with Fox really is contingent on this next couple of fights. These pay-per-views they're going to be having very soon. Spence Pacquiao, potentially getting Canelo over there, and what happens beyond that, and what happens with Wilder and Fury the third time. I get the sense that, they need something big to happen for them, and perhaps that's why certain fighters are sitting out, and they didn't roll out a big schedule the same way that Showtime did. I get the sense that, they need to deliver something big to Fox, a few big things actually, in order for the higher-ups at Fox to continue spending money on this stuff. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Callum Smith will return and make his light heavyweight debut either on AJ vs. Usyk September 25th or planned show in Liverpool on October 9th. Eddie Hearn told me, he added, that Lawrence Okollie will defend his WBO cruiserweight title versus mandatory Dylan Prasovic on AJ's card. And that's nice. That's at least two world title fights in September on the 25th. Unbeaten Dylan Prasovic of Montenegro, 26 years old, sporting a professional record of 15 wins, no losses with 12 knockouts. Those 12 knockouts are
Against nobodies.
against mostly unheralded competition. I understand that the cruiserweight division is not a division full of household names. In the West, least of all, but anybody who follows this division will know the who's who fighters. You won't find a Yuri Kalenga, a Noel Gavor, a Durudola, a Masternak, just, fighters along those lines that have been in high-level fights at this weight. You won't find those kinds of fighters in Dylan Prasovic's overall resume. And, that says a lot. That says a lot about the level of competition that he's faced so far. This will be a sizable step up in competition for him, trying to challenge the newly crowned WBO Cruiserweight champion, Lawrence Okollie, for that title. And listen, it's good news because the sooner they get Dylan Prasovic out of the way, the sooner they can start working on the unification match between Mairis Briedis, who has a mandatory of his own to take care of. The sooner they get the mandatories out of the way, the sooner they can start working on what could very well be Okollie versus Briedis unification match for not just 2 alphabet titles, but the coveted Ring Magazine title as well. So this is good news. Callum Smith, who we already knew, he's moving up in weight. He's had a trainer switch. He's not with Tesco Joe anymore. He's with Buddy McGirt now. He's not wasting any time, and that's what I see. He's not waiting a full year before he decides to get back out there and get back in the winner's bracket. The Canelo Alvarez fight took place late last year in December. Obviously, hasn't been a year's time yet, and he will have seen action in less than a year's time if this story checks out, and he fights
October 9th.
in October. September 25th or October 9th, really. They're playing with both of those dates. Good on him. He's got to crack on. He lost his first professional fight to Canelo Alvarez, lost his titles. There's no shame in that. The show must go on, and the show does go on. Callum is going to be a part of that show in late September or early October against an opponent that has yet to be announced. No idea who. There's a big enough talent pool at 175 pounds and enough familiar faces to go around that he shouldn't face a scarcity of opponents. There are ample names and ample fighters to go around for everybody. The guys on the top-ranked side of things and the guys on the matchroom side of things. I look forward to that. In other news, Kevin Haney will likely return in October, Eddie Hearn informed me. He welcomed Richard Commey, Gary Russell Jr. if Jojo Diaz fights Ryan Garcia, becomes the second Haney mandatory not to face him. He was quoted as saying, "That says everything you need to know about what people think of Devin." And these recent quotes coming from Eddie Hearn indicate what I told you guys in a previous video, that even though Devin Haney is a network free agent, he doesn't have anything on paper tying him to DAZN. That doesn't mean he won't fight there, and that doesn't mean that Eddie Hearn isn't still in his corner. For the time being, that's exactly where he appears to be.
Everything we've seen
Has been a play from the Devin Haney people in order to field offers from other outfits on other platforms. Other outfits like the PBC, other outfits like Top Rank, that if platform issues were the reason that Devin Haney wasn't getting fights with certain fighters, they have attempted to alleviate those issues, and yet the fights still aren't happening. The Gervonta Davis people haven't extended an olive branch to Devin. We heard rumors of them wanting to fight Jojo Diaz. Instead, Teofimo, he's all tied up with George Kambosos Jr. for the time being, and Vasyl Lomachenko's waiting on him, not Devin. So even though Devin is a network free agent, it's the same situation. Nobody really seems to be in a hurry to fight this guy, aside from Richard Commey, who very recently expressed an interest in facing Devin, and they had a little bit of back and forth action on Twitter. Eddie Hearn mentioned Richard Commey, former IBF champion Richard Commey, and Gary Russell Jr., who's sat out.
The last time he fought was in February of last year.
It's been about 17 months since Gary Russell Jr. had a fight. He's been made an offer by Eddie Hearn since then. Back when Josh Warrington was still the IBF's featherweight champion, Eddie offered Gary like $1 million to come over and have a fight. Gary turned it down. So, if he turned down $1 million to fight Josh Warrington, which isn't even as risky a fight as fighting Devin in the lightweight division, it's safe to say that Gary's not a front runner to land that Heaven Haney fight. I think the Richard Commey fight, and I think the Richard Commey people would be more receptive to an offer to fight Devin than Gary. Gary's comfortable sitting out and doing interviews and threatening everyone.
Ooh, I want you shouting.
But Devin fighting Richard is contingent upon what happens with Jojo Diaz and Ryan Garcia. We know that both Jojo and Bill Haney, Devin's father, they had a back and forth on the Boxing Voice, and we talked about that here on the channel, in spite of what's being said when the cameras are rolling, in spite of what public statements are made. Ultimately, we don't know what's going to happen there. Jojo might be telling Bill Haney one thing and telling Ryan Garcia and his people another. We just don't know. I think it's too soon to accuse anyone of ducking anyone because Joe ain't made a fight with either of those two guys. So we can't accuse him of ducking just yet.
We've got to see this through.
Before we rush to judgment and jump to conclusions, I think that Joseph Diaz will have some answering to do if he ends up fighting Ryan as opposed to Devin, because he said he was going to do everything in his power to fight Devin. And fighting Ryan, well, that ain't it.
That's you doing everything in your power to fight Devin? Fighting somebody else?
I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The onus isn't on the champion to challenge the challenger. The onus is on the challenger to challenge the champion. And that's what Joseph Diaz is. He's the challenger. So if you really want Devin, and you really want that fight, it's on you to pursue it. If you don't want to pursue it, the blame don't fall on Devin. It falls on you.
And it's not like Ryan versus Jojo is a bad fight.
No, it's not a bad fight, but that's besides the point, because we're not trying to gauge which fight is a good fight and which one is a bad one. What we're trying to gauge is who wants the Devin Haney fight and who doesn't. And if Joseph ends up fighting Ryan instead of Devin, well, I guess you didn't want that fight that bad.
Because you can actually force him to fight you, force him to vacate.
Joseph is the mandatory challenger to the green belt that Devin holds. And, you know, if Joseph Diaz ends up fighting Ryan Garcia, and whatever the aftermath of that is, Richard Commey is an even better, more intriguing option than Joseph Diaz would have been.